Technical Coordinating Committee meeting to order. Starting with self-introduction, starting with our representative from Orinda.
Jason Chen, City of Orinda.
Lori Reese Brown, City of Richmond.
Andy Diller, Town of Danville and SWAT.
Jamar Stamps, Contra Costa County.
Ahmed Abouali, City of Antioch.
Eric Hughes, City of Pleasant Hill.
Andy Smith, City of Walnut Creek, here for Transpac.
Tom Jerez, straight out the transit.
Jerry Fay, Contra Costa County.
Stephanie Mack, MTC.
Steve Kersavan, City of Brentwood.
Leah Greenblatt, Wick Tech.
Nikki Folletta, Wig Bart. Ruby Horta, County Connection.
Yvette Ortiz, City of El Cerrito, Wick Tech.
Thank you very much. Public comments. Anybody from the public or not on the public but wants to say something that's not on the agenda? Going once, going twice. All right. Moving forward, approval of summary of actions from our meeting last month on April 20th.
Move to approve.
Second.
Moved by Jerry, second by Steve. All say aye.
Aye.
Ayes have it. Moving on to consent calendar. Do I have a motion?
Motion. Moved. So moved.
Yeah, a second. Moved by Andy, second by Steve. All say aye.
Aye.
Thank you. All right. Project monitoring. Upcoming obligation deadline for federal aid projects and state STIP projects and active transportation program projects. Stephanie?
Hi, good morning, committee members. This is an informational item. Pages 3.3 and or all the way to 3.9 show the monitoring reports for STIP, OBAG, inactive, and ATP projects. For OBAG, all the fiscal year 16-17 projects have been obligated. There are two FY17-18 projects program, and they're shown on page 3-6. These projects have a RFA or request for authorization deadline of November 1st. And for the inactive projects shown on page 3.7 through 3-8, please note there are a few projects that require action by May 19th. That's tomorrow. I have already emailed these project sponsors about them, so hopefully they have taken action. And for others who are in the bottom of the list that have later dates, please make sure you take action before those due dates. And related to project delivery, MTC requires each agency to designate a single point of contact or SPOC for all FHWA administered projects who will deal with FHWA, Caltrans, us, MTC for all federal funding issues. So there are two SPOC trainings coming up. One is sub-regional and one is regional. And the sub-regional training will focus on SPOC responsibilities and CMA responsibilities and MTC programming requirements and policies. There are four options or locations for the sub-regional training, and CCTA is hosting one next Tuesday here from 10 to 12. And then there's a second training that's regional or Bay Area-wide that will be held at Caltrans on June 6th from 9 to 12. And this training will be focused more on local assistance and the federal aid process. So all of the SPOCs for the agencies are responsible to attend, or they're mandatory. So make sure your SPOCs for your agencies sign up through the flyer that I and MTC sent out earlier this week and last. So with that, I'll take any questions that you guys may have.
Stephanie, on the regional one, at the top of the thing it says it's required, and at the bottom it says it's recommended.
It's required. I mean, it's strongly advised that you go.
Take the more conservative of the two. Any other questions? All right. Thank you, Stephanie. Moving on, local streets and roads, regional initiatives, and work plan outreach.
So that's my item again. So this item is also informational. Teresa, Romel, and Sui Tan are here today from MTC to conduct outreach to local agency staff to solicit input on any proposed regional initiatives or focus areas for future local streets and roads issues. There is a monthly local streets and roads working group that actually meets at MTC, and lately there hasn't been a lot of local participation, so they're here today to outreach to you all to gather input on future focus for local streets and roads and how to work better together in partnership to achieve those goals. So with that, I'll have Teresa come up.
Thank you for having us here today. Sui Tan and I have been doing what we've been calling a road show to the various counties in the region to talk about issues related to streets and roads and try to get input, mainly from public works directors, but from anybody who has an interest in it. How can we better engage our local jurisdictions at the regional level, get more participation, and hopefully work with you all to bring about improvements from where we can that benefit local streets and roads and improve the state of good repair in the region of our roadways. So I've been with MTC for about 16 years and SUI about 15 years, and we've seen a lot of changes in our regional streets and roads program. Over the last 30 years or so, MTC has been involved in streets and roads, and we developed the Street Saver program, which all of our jurisdictions in the Bay Area use, and the Pavement Technical Assistance program as well. We also are the liaisons for the Regional Streets and Roads, Local Street and Road Working Group, which meets once a month at MTC to talk about issues related to streets and roads. And we've been working with this group for quite a while. Actually, in your agenda packet, there is a memo that includes the mission statement of the Local Streets and Roads Working Group, which is essentially, in a nutshell, to advocate for issues related to streets and roads, to advocate for additional revenue and for a better state of good repair. Just a few samplings of the benefits that the Streets and Roads Working Group has brought over the years for street and roads. They're listed in your memo, but in a nutshell, better representation of local jurisdictions on our partnership board is one of them. And when I first started at MTC, the RTP, or the Regional Transportation Plan that was in process at that point, invested about $140 million over the 25-year period for street and road maintenance. Our most recent, our current plan, invests about $10 billion over the same time period. So you can see the impact that the public works directors working through the working group and MTC have brought in terms of actual funding, actual dollars for the road repair. We are looking today to get not only ideas for the working plan, which we want to put together, but also to encourage more participation by local jurisdictions in the working group, because I think over the years there's been more money for streets and roads, but we've seen participation kind of dwindling, and our working group meetings have become less impactful as they have been in the past. It was not always like that. We had a really strong working group that was very proactive, putting together proposals, really engaging at the policy level, at the regional policy level. So we'd like to bring back a little bit of that element as well. Some ideas for the working plan, now that we have the passage of SB1, we feel this is a really good opportunity to try to make the most of those funds. We know that it's not the funding coming from SB1 is not a silver bullet for street and road maintenance. We estimate that the revenue will hopefully stop the hemorrhaging of cash and at least help us to maintain our existing conditions. But for most jurisdictions, their road conditions are projected to continue to decline slightly, not as much as before SB1, but still. So what we'd like to do is take the opportunity to see what can we do at the regional level to make these funds go a little bit further. Are there things that we can do in terms of, incentivizing certain cost-saving treatments, maybe encouraging some sort of economies of scale through better procurement processes. City of San Francisco is actually putting an asphalt recycling plant on their property. and, to try and get better pricing, because as we know, once all of this SB1 funding kind of hits the street, so to speak, prices are going to increase. It's going to be harder to get contractors, and prices will go up, meaning that the funding will be less effective. So that's why we're here today. We're just kind of traveling around the region, trying to elicit ideas, trying to get more support for our working group meetings, and try to engage you all a little bit more at the regional level. So that's it. That's my spiel. So I'm happy to take any comments, or if you'd prefer, you can certainly contact us after the meeting if you have any ideas.
Any questions for Teresa? Andy?
Regarding PTAP funds, maybe consider, we all go to a lot of meetings, but maybe to get some more participation in the working group, maybe have a tie to requirement to have some participation on the working group to be eligible for PTAP. This is a suggestion.
Okay. Take that into consideration.
All right. Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Moving on, review and approve CCTA countywide travel demand model evaluation study results and recommendations. Matt?
Thank you. I'm here today with our consultant, Mike Aronson from Kittleson Associates. The reason we're here today is because every 10 years we undertake what we call the decennial update of our travel demand forecasting model, otherwise known as the countywide model. It's the model you guys use, or at least consultants you hire use to do local traffic studies, to do general plan amendments, and we use it here to analyze our countywide transportation plan, EIR, among other things. It gets a lot of use over the years, and it's an important tool, and we're actually required to have it under state legislation. But every 10 years, and we do it at the 10-year increment. So our last one was in 2010, and at that point we took our existing model and completely overhauled it, brought in all the new assumptions from MTC's model, which we are required to be consistent with. However, in 2010, MTC had kind of moved beyond the type of model we were using, had moved beyond the type of model we were using, and so remaining consistent with their model started being more difficult at that time. In 2010, we were still just a couple years off from MTC's modeling platform, so we were pretty consistent at that point, but it started getting further and further away as the years went on. And now that we're looking forward to 2020, we know that we need to do something in order to maintain consistency with MTC's model. And I'll have Mike describe more in depth the difference between the types of models, but we currently have a 4-step trip-based model where MTC has moved into the activity-based model, which you might have heard about if you get into modeling speak at all. Activity or tour-based models. They're more detailed in terms of how they track a person's travels during their daily trips. So that's one primary reason we did this model evaluation study, was to look at the possibility of going to an activity-based model, or whether it would be smarter to stay with our current model and try and make changes to that and an attempt to remain consistent with MTC. But there's also other things we want out of the model. We want it to be able to accurately test your projects and developments at the local level, which the MTC model hasn't been able to do in the past. It's been more of a regional model. However, MTC is upgrading their model and making it more fine-grained, so it now has more of an ability to look at local changes to the transportation system and to the land use. But we also want it to be able to test new transportation technologies, whether they be operational in nature like express lanes or ramp metering, but also the things that the authority is interested in, like connected vehicles, autonomous vehicles, things like that. So there were several reasons why we asked Kittleson, who developed our current model and is our on-call modeling support consultant. So we asked them as part of their support contract to open up this study, work with the Technical Modeling Working Group, which is a subcommittee of this group, though none of the members are here today, I don't think. But we did meet with them twice over the last month to go over the findings in the model evaluation study. And they have a recommendation. I'm going to let Mike go through his presentation before we talk about the recommendation. But he's going to go through and talk about some of the background that I kind of already went over, but also discuss the criteria and options that were selected for study. So I'm going to turn it over to Mike and have him kind of walk you through the steps we took and then get into the recommendation. Go, Mike.
And to click forward, it should be that one. That one. All right. Thank you, everyone. I'm Mike Aronson with Kittleson and Associates. For those who aren't as familiar with Kittleson Associates, for a long time we were called Dowling Associates here in the Bay Area. And actually, the staff who've been working on this have been involved with Contra Costa modeling since 1990 or so. Even earlier generations of the model, just at different firms, but now we're Kittleson and Associates. But you're dealing with a lot of the same people who've been familiar with the needs of the individual agencies in Contra Costa County for quite some time. So this is the travel model update evaluation study that we worked through with Matt and with the committee. I'm going to try not to spend too much time on the things Matt already covered, but talk about the purpose of the evaluation, the modeling needs, the criteria we used, 5 update strategies that we looked at, a summary of the evaluation, and then the recommendations that came out of the committee. So again, the purpose of the travel model update evaluation, as Matt said, we want to enable CCTA and the member jurisdictions to answer the next generation of questions that are coming up. We want to plan for the next update. One of the side things is to reconsider the choice of software that's used for the model. And another issue is integration with other tools that are used for traffic operations. We're getting much better at doing simulations. You might have seen some cases where someone showed you a nice animation of traffic conditions somewhere in the county. That's a whole separate set of software, but it's getting closer to where you can do your forecasting software and your operations software and have those talk to each other better. So want to look at some of those issues as well. So in terms of modeling needs, we have ongoing needs. CCTA, and you have to do a countywide transportation plan. There's the Measure J requirements, which says you have to use a model to evaluate land use decisions in the major land use decisions in the county. General plan amendments, and then as Matt said, your model's used for a lot of local land use studies. We use it all the time, even for relatively small, either development impact studies or even looking at transportation issues like complete street studies or a recent study we just helped WICTAC with on their major I-80 transit needs study. So there's a lot of studies that the model gets used for traditionally. And then looking at future needs, the requirements to do VMT analysis of projects in place of level of service. Travel model, if set up properly, can be a valuable tool for that. The fact you have express lanes coming into the county now and being able to properly assess people's choices in using those lanes. New modes, ride sourcing like Uber and Lyft. Right now, none of the travel models anywhere in the Bay Area have that as an alternative. Most of them don't even have taxi as an alternative for that matter. So, we really have to start considering how those affect people's choices. And then, as Matt said, connected and autonomous vehicles. How does that change the operation of roads? How does that change people's decisions? How does it change things like whether they decide to own a car or not? How does it affect access to transit? So these are all future needs we're looking for. And all of those, your current model can do bits of them, but would require a fair amount of work to really answer those questions. The criteria the group came up with, cost, and that's both development of a model and the ongoing maintenance of it. The more complicated you make the model, the more cool things it can do. It also takes more money every time you use it for a study because there's more inputs, more things to look at. So cost is a consideration. Speed, I don't know how many of you deal with things that take several days on a big high-speed computer to run, but a model is one of them. Right now, your model can run on a decent workstation in like half a day or so, which is pretty nice. It means we can start it up in the morning and see results in the afternoon. The new MTC model, right now, they're working on making it better, but it takes almost a week to run one scenario on it. So, just in terms of you getting your work done, we want to consider speed. As Matt said, consistency with the MTC regional model so that you aren't coming up with priorities that are completely different than the regional transportation plan. Policy sensitivity. Are we able to answer questions about land use, about different modes, about new modes? And also local sensitivity. Can you use it for a very local project? As I said, operations integration, so how well can we get into very detailed operations or simulation of traffic movements? Accessibility of the model. For someone like Matt, how easy it is for him to go in and see what assumptions or answer questions from you about what assumptions are being used in planning and how easy it is to run. The level of effort, like I said, required to get the model going, to put things together. And portability, as Matt said, a lot of times the model is used by other agencies or by consultants, and if the model is too complicated, it makes it very hard to move to other people, and again, that's a cost to you in doing your studies, so you want to make sure that it's something that can move around. The strategies we looked at, 5 basic strategies. One is to stick with the current model, which works. It's running in our office right now on something, I'm sure. And you can update it by just updating the input assumptions, just making sure that the land use forecasts are up to date, make sure that the transportation plans are up to date, and that model can continue to run. And there are other counties that kept their model going many, many years just by updating the assumptions and making sure that the land use and assumptions are consistent. We can enhance the current model. You can keep the basic structure and add the features you want. So you can add autonomous vehicles. You can add Uber and Lyft to the current model, but keep the basic structure. And again, make sure the assumptions are up to date. Strategy 3 is to develop an activity-based model, a more complex model based on the MTC model, the newer, more sophisticated MTC model, but build a CCTA version of it. And we can talk a little bit more about several ways that can be done. A 4th strategy is just use the MTC model. As Matt said, up until recently, the MTC model was not detailed enough to use for Contra Costa County studies. It just had your major arterials and your most major collectors. So any study where you were looking at anything below the arterial and major collector level, it just didn't have the detail, the geographic detail to answer the questions. And similarly with the land use, its land use was very general. The new MTC model that's being developed and put into place over the next year has the same level of detail as your county model does. So it's at the point where at least geographically it could do the job. So one option is just stop paying to support your own model and use MTC's model and let them do all the updates. And the last option is kind of a combination. It says, well, you can use the MTC model for your big regional studies, but we'd still like something that's quicker response just for Contra Costa County. So in that case, you would develop sort of a parallel, simple model that draws data from the MTC model but runs very quickly and is specified specifically to answer Contra Costa questions. But you'd still have to go back to the MTC model for any major studies like your countywide transportation plan. So those are the 5 strategies we looked at. And I'm not going to go through these in detail. This is sort of a rating system of minuses with kind of the brown, or we call it, the more brown there is, the more that's a strong negative, and the greens being more of a strong positive. But in summary, strategy 3, where you develop your own CCTA sophisticated activity model, that's the highest cost option, but definitely has the highest sensitivity because you get all the sensitivity of the MTC model plus anything you choose to add for things like autonomous vehicles. Strategy 4, if we use the MTC model, that's a relatively low-cost option. There's still going to be a cost because you still have to check it carefully of how well it's doing in Contra Costa County, but you don't have the development cost then. So it gives you very high consistency with MTC, lower cost, but it very much limits your flexibility. As I said, that model is very, right now, like I said, it's a week to run. Hopefully they'll have it down to a day or two by the time they're done with it. But it sits on a huge computer over at MTC. You'd have to either parallel their computer equipment or arrange with MTC to run it. So it limits your flexibility, and also you're stuck with whatever they choose to prioritize for things they want to analyze. If they aren't interested in autonomous vehicles, then you don't have autonomous vehicles. If they aren't interested in Uber, Lyft, I think they will be, but then you don't get that. If they aren't interested in certain transit options, you don't get that. So it limits your flexibility. Scenario 2, where we improve your existing model, that option, because there's a lot of people, including CCTA staff, who are very familiar with the structure of the existing model, that gives you very good accessibility. It means you have a lot of users who know how to use it. And you get, because you're enhancing the existing model, you get the answers to a lot of your questions. However, as Matt was saying, you start dropping more and more out of phase with the region and MTC. And there's certain kinds of questions that the more sophisticated model like MTC is running is better at answering, particularly anything relating to demographics or environmental justice, economic justice, things like that. Because the new MTC model really considers the demographics of every person, their income levels and things, and you can answer a lot more questions about things that are affected by things like income levels. So scenario 2 gets you part of the way there, but you fall further away from the region and you're still missing some of the capabilities. And for both scenarios 3 and 4, which are activity-based models, those are going to be a little less portable. They have a lot more pieces to them, a little harder to move around. So we did that kind of scoring of individual characteristics, and then the committee asked, can we see some kind of weighted score? And we did a weighting of the 5 strategies across the top there on the criteria. And after the first pass, it became clear that a couple of these criteria are more important than others. That, yes, these convenience features are important, but the most important thing is that it's sensitive to what you need, both the regional policies and your local land use decisions. So we gave those a weighting of 3 times the other factors. And the final scores come out at the bottom. Using the MTC model as is, while it scores well on consistency and cost, it does very poorly on all the other factors, so it ends up with a low score. Strategy 2, enhancing your current model, does pretty well, but again, it loses out on consistency and sensitivity to all policies. So the one that scores the highest is developing CCTA's version of an activity-based model based on the MTC model. That's the one that came out with the highest score. And did you want me to run through these, Matt?
Sure.
Okay. So the recommendations are, first of all, one consideration is the model area. Right now your model covers all 9 counties of the Bay Area. So you have Gilroy in your model, you have Healdsburg in your model. The recommendation is to continue to keep that 9-county Bay Area as the model area. At some future time, consider expanding to include San Joaquin County to look at issues like State Route 239 in more detail. But right now the recommendation is to keep it with the 9 counties as it exists today. The recommended structure is to develop an activity-based model based on MTC, what they call Model 2. They have Model 1 running now for their regional plan. Model 2 is going to be used for the next regional transportation plan. It's up and running, but it's being refined right now. So it's anticipated to be ready in hopefully 2018, and we're saying possibly 2019. And when that's fully calibrated and tested, develop a CCTA model based on that platform. And then, depending on how well it performs, consider development of a simplified version for more quick response studies, local studies. The recommendations for software, in the short term, because you're going to have to wait for the MTC model to be done, continue with your current software, which is called Transcad, and continue to use it and continue to update the existing model, do minimal updates to keep it running. And if you develop a local model, you can continue with the Transcad software because, like I said, there's a lot of local familiarity with that software. As you go to activity-based modeling, the recommendation is to transition to a competing software, Cube Voyager, which is what MTC is using. They both do the same, basically the same things. It would be a little bit of a training for the people who are used to the TransCAD, but it doesn't take too long, and that makes you very consistent with MTC for software updates and things. Additional improvements that are recommended are getting express lanes in as a choice, because you have those coming in. Looking at issues of road capacity when you have connected autonomous vehicles in the fleet. Expanding the choice of modes to consider ride sourcing, as they're calling Uber and Lyft, and automated vehicles as a choice as those come into the market. And then also looking at issues of parking and transit access. I also should mention auto ownership when automated vehicles come in, and making sure that the structure of the model can adapt to those choices as we learn more about them. The implementation is to continue minor updates of the current model until it can be replaced. And the minimal updates are just making sure the land use projections and forecasts are up to date, and making sure your transportation projects are up to date. Nothing about the structure. To develop an activity-based model based on MTC Model 2 after Model 2 has been completely MTC's verified it's working. There'd be a validation to 2017 counts, and right now CCTA is collecting a whole series of counts around the county. And when I say counts, that's both traffic and transit. That's being done for the congestion management plan update. So there'll be a whole database of counts. So sometime around 2019 or so, you'd have those 2017 counts, and you could verify the model for that count year. After the 2020 census data becomes available, which will be about 2021 or 2022, you'd probably want to update your base year validation to 2020, and also use any new information you get from the 2020 census in terms of demographics. And then at some point, and this is very optional, consider development of this simplified overlay local model. Potential timeline. This year, there'll be likely a minor update of the existing model to be consistent with Plan Bay Area 2040 that MTC just released, and confirm the strategy. In 2018, a validation database can be assembled based on 2017 traffic counts and transit ridership. Sometime between 2019 and 2021, you'd want to get hardware in place compatible with MTC Model 2. And hopefully, like I said, by 2019, MTC has Model 2 working. So you obtain it and test it and see how well it does in Contra Costa County. And then start doing modifications to it you can simplify the level of detail outside Contra Costa County, possibly improve the level of detail in Contra Costa County, and all that's designed to get it to be more responsive. And then around then, you complete a validation to the 2017, and like I said, at a later time, update the validation to 2020. That's the recommendations of the evaluation report, and we'd be happy to take any questions.
And I just wanted to add a couple of things. You as the end user of the model, you probably won't notice, if we were to go with this recommendation and transition to an activity-based model, you probably wouldn't notice a whole lot different in what you're getting out of the consultants who prepare your traffic studies or general plan amendments. But there may be different consultants that you would have to use. Some consultants are better at working with activity-based models than others. But I think in the next few years, you're going to see a lot more consultants being able to work with activity-based models. Besides MTC, San Francisco, SFCTA has an activity-based model. I believe VTA is in the process.
Maybe not, but Sacramento's had one for about 10 years, so anybody who does work in Sacramento has been.
And then Marin, TAM, the Transportation Authority of Marin, has basically come up with a recommendation in the last year or so to do exactly what we've recommended. They want to take the MTC model, Travel Model 2, and adapt it for their own uses. And then Solano and Napa have built a activity-based model, except on the existing MTC model. So they're kind of a step behind us, but still activity-based. And so, yeah, so that's the recommendation. We're glad to answer any questions.
Yeah.
I have two questions based on the staff report. So it mentions that, I'm looking at page 5-3 up at the top, that the activity-based models use an individual daily trip diary, and I'm wondering what's the source of that? Like, is that, just a small percentage, or are we able to use big data and like cell phone data, that kind of thing?
No, you've hit on one of the places where big data doesn't do a very good job yet. So every 10 years or so, there's a detailed survey done where people do keep trip diaries of all their records. And I don't know what the percent sample, so it was done in 2011, 2012. Caltrans actually did it on behalf of the whole state. So there were several thousand households in the Bay Area that kept detailed trip diaries, and I forget how many throughout the state. Those are then, when the activity-based model is developed, those survey, the kind of survey information is correlated with demographics. So you look at the age of people and their type of occupation and things, and they sort of come up with relationships of sort of these type of people do these range of activities and take these range of mode, have these preferences for modes. And so then there's a synthesis process. When they run the activity-based model, they actually kind of develop a profile of every person in the Bay Area based on the available census information. And then those people are then given a range of choices based on the survey data. So it's not like it's every 65-year-old person, goes to Costco at 10 a.m., but they're this likely to go to Costco as opposed to this likely to go to work. And they're this likely to use a bike versus this likely to use a car for this length of trip. So there's a whole set of probabilities that come from these several thousand survey records and are tied to the demographics. And then the calibration, as you can imagine, is pretty complex. They have to see how well those estimates do and constantly fine-tune the choices until things replicate actual observed behavior. But then when you go to the future, you have your future population. So if you have an aging population, you might have more people taking taxis, for example, in the future because that's their demographic, and maybe a lower percentage of work trips and a higher percentage of social or medical trips. So the activity-based model takes all that kind of demographic into account, but it's based on a few thousand survey records and then come up with correlations.
Okay. And then,
can I ask a follow-up question to that, actually, before you move to your next?
Sure.
Just so I understand, that survey data is just used to calibrate behavior trends, not actual specific trips, correct?
Yeah, because it's such a small thousand households.
Okay, I just want to make sure.
So you use that to get the behavior trends, and then your validation set is you have your traffic counts, your transit ridership. So if you apply those trends and you have the right number of people taking BART between Orinda and Rockridge, then you think you're on the right track.
All right, thanks.
all right. Same page. Next paragraph. It talks about the authority's trip-based model and that it's not consistent with MTC's, particularly with regard to the transit network. And I'm wondering why that is. And then how does the recommendation address that issue with transit?
Mike is a very good person to answer this question, especially as it relates to a recent transit study that the model was used for.
Under any of these strategies, including strategy one, we'd want to update the transit network. And because your model has not been used as often for detailed transit studies until the I-80 corridor study, I would say it did a pretty good job of generally representing transit, but not very good in specific. It was coded to be very consistent with the MTC model it was derived from back in the early 2000s. And it was updated as needed. For instance, the BART service was always kept very up to date. But some of the individual bus lines were still kind of looked a little bit like service in the early 2000s. So they had about, nobody knows this because it had about the right level of service, but the specifics weren't very good. So under any of these strategies, even if you just keep your current model, we would recommend updating those assumptions. As far as being consistent, MTC few years ago did a major job. They were also very deficient on keeping their transit up to date. They did a major update to their transit network. And one of the advantages of adapting their model is we can take advantage of all that work they did. And one of the key things they did is traditionally the models only represented general peak service and general off-peak service. And now the MTC model now represents individual time periods, AM peak service, PM peak service, midday, night service. So again, you can take advantage of all those updates as well. So the existing model was pretty good for general representation of access, and it did BART pretty well. But buses, under any strategy, we'd want to improve the bus representation. But the good news is, if you adapt the MTC model, they've done a lot of the work.
Thanks.
That was kind of basically my question. I'm Nikki Folletto with BART. Just wanted to, kind of clarify how well the MTC model validates transit and whether there could be any improvements in this CCTA activity-based model. So I think you answered that, and we're definitely interested in seeing a focus on transit and validating to transit. So my other question is, you mentioned that the MTC model might take like half a day to run. So do you have any estimate of how long you think this CCTA activity-based model might take to run a model run?
No, it's actually your current CCTA model takes about a half day to run. The MTC model that they're working on for the next Plan Bay area, Model 2, which is the one we're recommending you adapt, right now takes about a week to run. But it's kind of in the development stage, so they have things very loose. They're going to tighten up all the code and things as they go. So, and then the recommendation is to take that model and simplify it. A lot of the reason it takes so long is because it's modeling every single street in the 9 counties and every single bus route. You don't necessarily need all that detail in Gilroy or in Half Moon Bay. So you can simplify a lot, and that speeds up the processing considerably. Also, the level that you represent the demographics, you can be very refined in Contra Costa County and be a little less precise as you get further away. So this is what the strategy recommended for Marin County. They're talking about kind of simplifying it the further away you get from your study area. So we'd hope to get it down to less than a day. The best situation is you can either run it overnight, start it overnight and see the results in the morning, or start it at the beginning of the workday and see the results by the end. So I think that would be the target, is to get it down. And of course, computer equipment gets faster all the time. So one of the reasons the modelers keep making things more complicated, they say, well, it takes a week to run now, but on the computer equipment you'll have in 2020, it'll take, an hour. It doesn't quite reduce that much, but that's also the idea, is to make it a little more complicated now, and then computer equipment will catch up.
Eric? I had a couple questions.
Go ahead.
Just building off of Nikki's question, how detailed, which counties will you model in a more detailed fashion? Will it, like Alameda County, what other counties will you model to the same level of detail as Contra Costa County?
That's anything that borders Contra Costa County, you'd want at the higher level of detail.
Okay.
And then anything that's an important destination, for instance, downtown San Francisco, because BART ridership is so important for so many parts of Contra Costa County, and particularly for transit-oriented development, that you'd want downtown San Francisco along the BART line to stay pretty detailed as well. So with transit, you have to look not only at your end, but also the other end, and make sure you're really representing. So much of what happens at BART in Contra Costa County depends on what parking conditions are like in downtown San Francisco, or walk accessibility and things like that. So anywhere that's an important destination for transit in particular, you'd also want to keep somewhat detailed.
And we have major gateways into the county, these screen lines that we look at, where we, check the validation at those points, like, 680 at the Sunol grade. So we make sure any travels between Santa Clara and Contra Costa through Alameda are accurate.
One other question. You said one of your considerations for evaluation was the sensitivity to urban form and walkability. So can you talk about what this model brings to those concepts?
The MTC Model 2, for certain aspects, particularly walkability, it operates at a very fine block level. So it actually is starting to measure things like walkability at a level even more detailed than the main model itself. The main model itself is more concerned with like street networks and transit networks, which are kind of more on a block, like say a collector arterial sort of level. But the new MTC model is being designed so that you can measure things like accessibility and walkability at a very fine, almost parcel level of detail. So when you're measuring things like walkability and accessibility, you do it at this very fine parcel level, and then you bring that information into the modeling, which works more at the street transit bus line level.
Any other questions? I got a quick one. seems like this option recommendation that staff is recommending, I guess, the main downside obviously is the level of effort to develop and also, to run and portability and also the cost. A bulk of this will be borne by your budget, right, to develop and to maintain. I'm assuming you guys are okay with that?
Yeah, we do have a slide on the cost. I don't want to focus too much on the cost, but because overall, all of the options fit into the current budget we have that we used in our last decennial update, which is about the actual development costs were about $750,000 for the current model, and the highest option, the option 3, the most expensive option, tops out at $800,000. It's a range from, I believe, $600,000 to $800,000.
Something, yeah, it depends on how much you want to add to it.
So the actual model update costs are comparable to our past model update costs. We do get federal funds to do a lot of our modeling and help from MTC. So right now we're not too concerned about the costs. We hope that technology in a couple of years will bring down some of those costs, but we're trying not to get hung up on the costs at this point because we do feel like they're comparable with past model update costs overall. And
the past model update, the model you have now was developed basically from scratch. It was based on the MTC model, but it was really built from scratch. So a lot of the cost was building and testing custom software specifically for Contra Costa County. So we're hoping by adopting a strategy where you're using the MTC model and all their software, that's originally a cost savings, and then yes, there is a little burden to it because you have to have a little better computer, you have to invest in a little more computer equipment, and there's going to be a bit of a learning curve because it has more inputs to deal with all these demographics we were talking about. But at least the starting point, it's actually a less costly way to go than the way your last model was done, which was built from scratch with custom software.
And the benefit would be the added functionality you get on top of that.
All right. Oh, thank you. Any other questions? Do I have a motion to approve, modify, or approve or modify the staff's recommendations?
Move approval of the staff recommendation.
Motion from Jamar. Do I have a second?
Second.
Second from Ahmed. And all in favor say aye.
Aye.
Congratulations.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
All right, moving on. Release of the draft 2017 countywide transportation plan update and draft CTP environmental impact report for public review. Hi, Martin.
Hi, I am not Martin. Martin is out getting his international driver's license in case he needs it on this vacation. Obviously not in the U.S. But last night the authority approved the release of the 2017 draft countywide transportation plan. We're scheduled to formally release it on the 24th. That's a week from yesterday. We'll also be releasing a draft environmental impact report in June, on June 12th. And then that will be start the 45-day review period for the EIR. So the comments will be due on July 28th. We'll be having a public meeting on the draft CTP update and the EIR at the July Planning Committee meeting. That's July 5th. We're also going to be doing some public outreach on the plan. We're going to have, similar to what we did earlier back in 2014, 2015, we're going to have online engagement tools. We're going to have a separate website. The website will be up pretty soon. It'll be definitely up on the 24th, and it's 2017ctbupdate.net. And we'll be doing an email blast to get that website address out to the public and to staff throughout the county. We're going to be holding a town hall workshop. It's going to be an open house format as well. We'll be having meetings with our Citizens Advisory Committee. We'll be going out to the RGPCs as well, and we're going to have some stakeholder toolkits. It'll be similar to what we're doing on the countywide bike pedestrian plan as well. So we're hoping that you'll visit the website, look at the CTP, give us your comments on it. The CTP is going to be a little bit different than our earlier ones. We're going to have a more detailed investment program, which is a requirement of MTC's CTP guidelines. It'll have a 10 and 20-year investment programs. The 10-year program will reflect the projects that are in Measure J and in the RTP. The 20-year one will assume a new measure or some alternative funding source to supplement the funding we expect. So if you have any questions, I'll try to answer them. If not, please get involved.
Yeah.
So what happens to the action plans from 2014?
Well, the action plans we'll have a summary of them as part of Volume 2, which is in the CDP, and we'll also be posting the draft action plans on our website, so people will be referred from the CDP website to the action plans that are on our website. The draft environmental impact report incorporates those projects and actions that are in the action plan so that the action plans will be cleared environmentally by our environmental impact report, so that once the authority certifies the environmental impact report, the RTBCs will be able to use that environmental impact report to adopt your final action plans.
But, they were approved for adoption or proposal for adoption back in 2014. If something's changed, are the RTPCs able to update their action plans?
Matt went away. I know Matt's been working with the RTPCs.
Nobody's got your back there, Matt.
Matt's been working with the RTPCs trying to address some of the 743 actions. I think minor changes that don't affect the environmental impact report will be fine, or the conclusions of and analysis of the EIR.
So what does that really mean? I don't know. Will our TAC be re-looking over those actions in the action plan and maybe modifying those? Will we have that ability?
Unless you don't need to do that. If you think your action plans are still adequate, and you're not, we expected you may want to make some minor changes to it, but I don't think it's necessary.
Sorry, I've missed most of this, but the goal was to not make any substantive changes, but to update them, like if there's actions that have been completed or ones that don't make sense anymore, something like that you could remove those, but not to come up with new MTSOs at this time.
Can we come up with new actions, though?
Well, the countywide plan is being modeled with the current actions in the plans, so that would put the EIR. Oh, that's Brad's department, but it depends on the action, I would say.
It will. The RTBC as your own lead agency in adopting your action plan will need to make some conclusions on whether they'll be based on the analysis that's in the EIR, whether would be a substantial impact that wasn't addressed in the IR by the new action that you're taking and the modifications you're making to the action plan. If you determine that there would not be a substantial change to the impacts, then you're okay.
Any other questions? You don't need an action from us, right? No. Okay. All right, moving on. The 2018 STIP process review and call for projects. Stephanie.
Hi, hello again. This is an action item that needs your recommendation and action. So the 2018 STIP process has begun, and the project priorities are due to MTC sometime in October. So in order to meet this deadline or schedule, staff is recommending a call for project to be released on June 22nd after the authority approval of the STIP process or after the June authority meeting. So as you know, STIP is updated every 2 years, and adding 2 years to the prior programming commitment. The 2018 STIP will be adding programming of funds to fiscal year 2022 and fiscal year 2023. Per MTC estimates, we expect the funding to be between $20 to $25 million for those 2 fiscal years for Contra Costa. The exact amount won't be known until CTC approves the fund estimate in their August meeting, and you may recall that the 2016 STIP had a fund estimate of negative $754 million because of declining gas prices. And as a result, authority had to delete $13.4 million from the 2016 STIP by removing BART's modernization project. So if funding is available in the 2018 STIP, the $13.4 million will be reprogrammed back to that project off the top. The tentative schedule for the 2018 STIP is shown on attachment A for your reference. Applications are due at 2 p.m. on July 28th. A subcommittee will meet sometime in early August to evaluate the projects. Staff will then seek approval of the ranked projects from APC and Authority Board in September. So staff is seeking your recommendation and comments on the screening and scoring criteria. The scoring criteria and the screening criteria are very similar to those from the previous STIP cycles, with transit and railway projects being evaluated separately. So I just wanted to point your attention to page 7-3 for the list of screening criteria, and I thought I would just run through them quickly so we're all on the same page. So first, project has to be consistent with the adopted RTP. Local project must be in the CMP. Candidate projects has to submit a draft PSR or PSR equivalent with the application by July 28th, and the final PSR has to submit to us by October 6th. Number 4, funds must be allocated for phases requesting STIP with the period between FY22 and FY23. Project phases must be fully funded with requested STIP funds and or other committed fund sources. Current STIP projects cannot seek additional funds for the same phase. Number 6, project must be solving an existing problem relating to safety, capacity, and or operations. The requested STIP funds must be capital improvements of at least $1 million. The railway projects must be on a collector roads or above as shown in the Caltrans CRS map. And since STIP funds are federalized, project sponsor has to be committed to go through the local assistance to complete the federal process. Projects that are operational in nature has to show commitment to operate and maintain a project for the life of the project. And lastly, there can be no more than 2 applications per jurisdiction. And just to note that in the past, we had required RTPC concurrence as part of the application, but we have taken that out to reduce the workload a little bit from the project applicant. And lastly, just want to remind everyone that per 2016 Measure J strategic plan, East County is precluded from competing in the 2018 STIP because the 2015 bond that the authority issued went directly to the EBART project. And lastly, we're asking TCC to form a subcommittee to evaluate all the project applications that we will receive. We're asking 2 volunteers from HRTPC and 2 volunteers from transit agencies. And again, the committee should be meeting in early August to go through the project. So to summarize, staff is asking for your comments or recommendations on the screening and scoring criteria, as well as asking for volunteers to form the subcommittee to evaluate the applications. With that, I will answer any questions that y'all may have.
I have a question. So you said that there's transit projects.
Correct.
So does that same committee evaluate the transit projects?
Correct. So in one of the attachments or the criteria or the scoring matrix for transit, I think they're attachment F and attachment H. So there's more information about transit projects on those 2 attachments.
To my right.
This isn't a question. So Lori Reese-Brown, City of Richmond. So I'm interested in serving as a volunteer on that committee.
Great, thanks. Thank you.
Andy?
If you could tell me, what's the thinking, what's the thinking, what do you think? I don't mean to ask, what are you thinking? But what are the thoughts? What's the reason for, for the 11th criteria about limiting it to 2 applications per jurisdiction without relation to population and size?
That was something we've done in the past, I think, to minimize the volume of applications we will get. I mean, we're looking at $20 to $25 million, so I think in the past we were overloaded with applications. Hisham might be better to give background as to why we had that requirements.
Besides streamlining the process, it's just to force the applicants to think about their top priorities for the STIP and submit those top priorities, 2 top priorities.
Okay, I mean, I'm not going to make a big deal out of this. It just seems a little odd that we have between our smallest and our largest city in the county more than a whole order of magnitude in terms of just population. I would think, Concord and Richmond might have a greater number of priorities than, I don't know, Clayton and Lafayette, just to throw them out. Not to throw anybody under the bus, but,
Get the buses out of there.
Yeah. So. I used to be a bus driver in college, so, I don't know. But anyway, I don't know. It just seems like maybe some sort of a sliding scale would be appropriate.
I think we had this criteria since probably I joined the authority 17 years ago. So it's up to the TCC if they want to increase the number, remove the limit, or restrict it further. I can tell you, I mean, in the past we were able to fund probably at the most in one cycle like 5 projects. So you must do the math, 2 times 20, that's 40 applications. I mean, the whole premise was to force the applicant to think about their applications and submit the ones that most likely will be funded, their best applications.
And I guess just chime in on that for Andy. In the past, because this application process is pretty labor intensive, and so a lot of the small agencies just naturally don't have the resources to submit that many, if any, especially given the lack of the small amount of funds that are available. Which leads to my other question is, right now I understand we're saying that there's approximately estimated $20 to $25 million available for Contra Costa County, and I think we just heard that maybe $13 million may go straight to the BART project that was reduced last year or last cycle. So really, in reality, we only have $7 to $12 million up for grabs, so to speak.
We'll know more in June. This is just the pure guesstimates at this point. But you're right. I mean, it's not a lot of money. I mean, one project could ask for the whole amount.
Right.
And I think the authority may submit a couple projects as well, and that restriction applies to the authority as well.
So it'll be just like previous cycles, the authority submit a project usually limits to freeway-type regional projects.
Correct.
Okay.
And there is, I know you mentioned, I can't remember if you mentioned it, but I mean, the minimum request is $1 million. The size of the project is $1 million. So we're not trying to fund really small projects, given how difficult the process is to go through the CTC and the local assistance.
Well, yeah, I mean, you know, federalizing it, in the words of our city engineer, he doesn't want to see it if it's less than $1 million if it's federalized. I just wanted to toss it out there. I mean, you know, Walnut Creek population-wise, we're kind of in the middle of the pack, so I don't think I really, from a city standpoint, have much of a horse in this race. I just wanted to toss it out there to see if the committee had anything to say on it.
If I may add, just one thing related to what Stephanie reported on. In the past, we had asked for the RTPC's concurrence on the applications, and basically what we found out in all the previous cycles that the RTPCs basically concur with all the applications. So we think this step is probably no longer necessary. So we took it out from the criteria. If you like it back in, this is your chance to add it back in.
I guess the only value of it, really, from RTPC standpoint, is at least we know going in what are the applications from the regions instead of finding out on the award or recommended list.
I mean, you can still do that. Requests the sponsors to copy you on the application, the RTPC manager on the application, or talk about it at the TAC meeting to see who's planning to apply.
All right. Any other questions or comments?
So we're requesting volunteers to serve on the committee. Thank you, Lori, for volunteering. So if I can.
You need 2 from each
Yes,
RTPC?
correct. And then 2 from transit.
Doesn't have to be on this committee, right?
No, I don't think. In the past, I think we did.
Just because
Yeah, committee,
I
yes.
think we have technically 2 representatives
So
from
all
each
of you will
committee
be on the
this.
committee.
So if technically the whole TCC will be on the committee.
Well, WICTAC, 3 of you are here, so.
I have a question before I commit myself. How?
You already did.
You can't take it back.
No, just kidding.
Well, how often would you have to meet? What time of day?
I think we were thinking just like one day or 2 at the most. Yeah.
What time of day?
August.
In August.
In the beginning of August. First 2 weeks.
Morning, evening, afternoon.
Yeah, we can work. Yeah, we'll do all day, and we'll work out.
All day. For what? 1 or 2 times?
No, just once. I think.
Once. Oh, okay. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Yeah, we can work around everybody's schedule. We'll try our best to accommodate various people's
All right,
schedules.
Okay, I'm thinking Jamar is trying to.
Jamar, okay.
I just wanted to verify that you do not need representatives of transplants since we're excluded from STIP.
Good idea.
Exactly.
Steve, are you volunteering?
Okay, Steve has a van.
Heather Ballinger from Walnut Creek, Paul Ryder from Pittsburgh, and Kevin Rahani from Oakland.
It's up to them. Like, you guys they can decide. Actually, no.
I think in past years they have.
Yeah, last cycle they weren't eligible, but they did volunteer. And we didn't end up scoring anything.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're really impartial, so that'd be nice.
Yeah. So, Jamar, would you like to participate?
I'll ask the TAC members if anybody's interested and get
All
back
right.
to you. Thank you.
Okay, looking for anybody who's dying to be on this committee.
So if Yvette doesn't want it, I'm happy to.
Okay, so Leah.
Happy.
So, see, WICTAC is done. Lori.
All right.
And so in transit, there's only BART and Tri-Delta. So, and the county connections. Sorry, honey. Sorry, I didn't see you. Okay. Thank you, Ruby.
Thank you, County Connection.
What, you want to?
Andy?
Tom, okay.
Which Andy? Does he count as our one?
Who? No, he's transit.
Just transit, not two hats. Okay.
Hey, Jamal, I knew that if I did the next transplant, if I didn't show up.
Got a comment from Andy Dillard?
Andy, did you want to?
Volunteer from SWAT.
Okay,
I'll volunteer from SWAT as well.
great. Thanks, Jason. Thank you, Andy. So transplant? Transpac, I mean?
I think we may have to go back to our group and see who can do it. Just because I don't think I can, and I've done 2 of these already this year.
Okay, so I'll touch base with transplant and transpac to see where the 2 volunteers will come from.
What's your deadline for getting this list finalized?
Probably sometime in July, yeah, July.
Oh, okay.
Yeah,
Plenty of time, okay.
okay. Thank you.
All right.
Thank you all for your time.
Wait, do you need action to release?
Yes, do you guys recommend the
Is there a
criteria?
motion to move the scoring criteria, I guess?
And the
or
screening
screening
criteria
criteria
and
for the
scoring
projects?
criteria.
So moved. Second.
Got a motion and a second. All in favor?
Thank you.
You should ask what Clayton represents.
All right, lastly, the coordinated call for project. Brad.
I'm handing out as an addendum to what's in your packet. Let me just briefly note that this item is about the coordinated call for project for the One Bay Area Grant, the second cycle, aka OBAG 2, and Measure J, Transportation for Livable Communities and Pedestrian, Bicycle, and Trail Facilities programs. We've received 77 applications. Not all of them went through the process, but most did. Many of you in this room were involved, either by being a sponsor or by serving on one of the committees reviewing the applications. The recommendations for the OBAG competitive program went to the OBAG Measure J working group. Several of you serve on that group. The OBAG Local Streets and Roads Preservation Program funds were allocated by formula to the 20 jurisdictions. The federal aid secondary was a grant that went to the county for a project in rural Contra Costa. Safe Routes the School programming was allocated to the regional committees for their recommendation. That went by formula based on population and school enrollment. The TLC funding from Measure J, interesting, that was allocated to the regional committees for their recommendations. And finally, the PBTF programming was funded, was reviewed by the Countywide Bicycle Pedestrian Advisory Committee. So all those groups have reviewed the projects. They've made their recommendations. We've been going through the process of trying to put all those into a single program. I've got my spreadsheet here with all the projects and the amounts that have been recommended for them. And let me go through what's in the packet. First, there's the summary of how many applications received, how many requests for the different funding sources, the allocations to the 20 jurisdictions for local streets and roads funding, then the Safe Routes to School recommendations. West County had 2 projects, Central 3, East County had 1, and Southwest had 3 as well. Then the federal aid secondary, and then the OBAG competitive. This program had 16 applications. The guidelines were that there were no more than $4.5 million in requests allowed. The top scoring project from each of the 4 areas would be funded, and those 4 projects were the El Cerrito del Norte project. It's an El Cerrito project. Bay Area Rapid Transit BART project. It's a Pittsburgh project around the city center E-BART station. The Monument Boulevard Class 1 path along Monument Boulevard in Concord, and the Iron Horse Trail overcrossing project in San Ramon. It is also getting funding through the TLC program as well. That leaves $680,000, and I'll discuss that when we get to the addendum. There are a number of other projects that would not get funding because there's just not enough funding to go around. One of the requirements of the MTC OBAG 2 program is that for the local streets and roads and the competitive program, at least 70% of that funding has to be spent on projects that are in or near priority development areas, because one of the key purposes for the OBAG 2 program is to encourage development and support development in those PDAs. So you look at the list, the competitive, about 96% of the funding will go to projects that are in or near PDAs, and of the local streets and roads, about 78%, for an average of 85%, which is better than the 70% we have to meet and better than the 82% that we had in OBAG 1. In the Measure J funding, there are listed in the packet the recommendations from West County, which total about $11.392 million. Actually, it's more than that, and there's one project that's missing. That's a Lincoln Elementary School project. They also there was $200,000 left over from a project that never went forward, and they've used that $200,000 to help fund additional projects in West County. In addition, and we'll get to that a little bit later, there's $280,000 in another program called Additional Bicycle, Pedestrian, and Trail Facilities, and that is specifically dedicated to West County, and they've used that money to fund the El Cerrito del Norte Station Access Improvement Project to help fund it. Central County, there are the projects listed. Those are basically the ones and that list, like all the others, has gone through some permutations over time, trying to respond to changes in funding that have come from other programs. Southwest County, also, here's their list of projects. That has not changed. There's no change in the addendum for those. Not in the amounts of funding, anyway. You'll note that there's no funding for East County, and that's because East County early on in Measure J decided to use their TLC funding for the E-BART project. So at some point, maybe in the future, there'll be TLC funding for East County, but we don't know how much and when that will happen. The pedestrian, bicycle, and trail facilities projects, those are listed there. There was, and I'll get to this later, there's some issues that will go on. So why don't we turn to the memo and go through some of the changes. The first is that there was some conflation of how much money was available for the PBTF funding. And this was the original funding recommended by the Countywide Bicycle and Pedestrian Advisory Committee. $7.9 million. We're going to use about 2/4 of fiscal year 23 funds to make up for that error that there was in the initial estimation of available funding. For the OBOG competitive, if you look in your packet, you'll note that there's $680,000, which was left after funding the top 4 projects. And the OBAG Measure J working group suggested at their last meeting that staff first talk to the county, which had the next most highly rated project. It was the Bailey Road Complete Streets project. And then to talk to Walnut Creek, which had the project next on the list, to see if they could use the funding. The county said that they couldn't use the funding for the project. Their request was almost $4 million, and the $680,000 was just not sufficient to go forward with the project. Similarly, with Walnut Creek, their request was also around $4 million, and they could use the funding to do conceptual design and traffic analysis, but while it's an okay use of CMAQ funds, using it without having secured the funds for the actual construction of the project means that the funds would be used at risk, and that the city may have to pay back the funds, and we, not just the county, but the whole region would lose the funding. So staff is recommending that we not allocate $680,000 to Walnut Creek. And we've talked to Walnut Creek staff about that. What the OBAG Measure J working group recommended was that if those 2 projects couldn't use the funding, that we split the funding among 2 of the higher ranked projects, the El Cerrito project, which still has somewhat of a funding gap, and the Iron Horse Trail project in San Ramon, which, even though it's fully funded, it's only fully funded because SWAT has agreed to allocate about $5 million in the next 2 TLC cycles to fund that, roughly $2.5 million in cycle 3 and $2.5 million in cycle 4 for that project. So that would, $2.5,680,000, it wouldn't make a huge dent, but it would help reduce the amount of money that needed to be set aside in those next 2 funding cycles. The other option is, because adding funds to the El Cerrito and San Ramon projects would mean that they would get more than $4.5 million, which is more than the maximum request in the guidelines, is to go down to the next projects. The next project, there are a couple of other projects that could use the funding, but most of them are also made requests over about $4 million. The next one that's close to being the $680,000 is I've forgotten. Where is it? Just went right out of my head. It's the L Street project. It did get funding from several other funding sources. So one of the questions we have for the TCC is whether you want to go with the recommendation of the OBAG Measure J working group to split the funding among 2 of those top 4 projects, or to continue down the list to see if someone else can use the funding, and going in order of the ranking that the working group came up with. I'll continue on we can come back to this. There are 2 funding swaps, I'll say. I'm not supposed to use that word, but shifts, transfers. One of the purposes of the coordinating call is to try to minimize the number of projects that have to go through local assistance. And since we allocated the Safe Routes to School funding which is federal, to Safe Routes to School projects would tend to be fairly small. What we thought we could do is to, if there was a project that was already had federal money on it, whether it's local streets or roads or Safe Routes to School, and they also had Measure J funding on it, we could take some of that Measure J funding, give it to projects that only had Safe Routes to School funding, and then take the Safe Routes to School funding from them and put it on to the other project. For example, on the third page, you'll see that there are 3 projects, 2 in Concord and 1 in Pleasant Hill. We've talked to Concord about this already. The staff we haven't had a detailed conversation because staff is on vacation until Monday. But the idea would be that we take some of the TLC funding away from one of the Concord projects and give the TLC funding to the other Concord project and the Pleasant Hill project, and then give the Safe Routes to School money to Concord. Their Safe Routes to School component is about that amount of money, so it would be eligible for the Safe Routes to School funding. So that's one. The other one is a shift between Moraga and Orinda, and we do have agreement from those 2 jurisdictions to make that exchange of $387,000. Finally, we're going through the process of contacting and getting confirmation from jurisdictions who asked for money, didn't get all the money that they requested, to make sure that they can use the money, make the project whole, either by making changes to their project scope, coming up with alternative funding to make up the funding gaps, including additional funding from their local sources. We've got confirmation for about half the projects on this list that, yes, they can use the funding. I'm hoping that by Monday, which is when I've asked to get the funding, new funding plans from them, that we can tighten that one aspect up. So we're asking now that the TCC weigh in on that one issue about what to do with the OBAG competitive funding, to approve the basic outlines of the program, and then allow the OBAG Measure J working group to make the final confirmation of the program when they're going to meet on Wednesday to go over that. So if there are any questions or comments, please. I will try to answer them.
Andy?
Thanks, Brad. I wonder, when I'm looking at the OBAG 2 list here, I see, the ranks in order, the scores, and there's this one outlier, the Iron Horse Trail, the Bollinger Canyon bike ped crossing. I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the asterisks. Is this Roger Maris's application, or?
I think you meant Pete Rose, but
No, that's a whole different thing. Funny thing, the one time I've seen Pete Rose in person outside of a ball game was in Vegas. Anyway. Yeah.
No, it doesn't. He's made it public. This is being broadcast to the universe. Okay. I won't go into the whole history of why this is, but one of the agreements and a part of the OBAG competitive program that the authority put in place is that besides the types of projects and the minimum and maximum requirements, that each of the 4 subregions would get their top-ranked project. So the El Cerrito project was top-ranked in the county and in West County. The Pittsburgh EBART Station project was top-ranked in East County. The Monument Boulevard was top-ranked in Central County. And the Iron Horse Overcrossing was top-ranked in Southwest County, even though there were 2 other projects that actually scored higher.
So that's in the written down criteria? Okay.
Yes, it's in the OBAG guidelines.
Leo?
I don't know how, I'm not always diplomatic on these things, but Brad, you just mentioned that the El Cerrito project was the top ranked in the county. It was the top ranked from WCTAC, and now it's short funds. So I fully support giving the OBAG project or the funds to fund that project fully, because it's obviously done well, and why would we want to short a project that meets so many of the criteria and ranks so well in multiple reviews?
I guess I don't recall, and I apologize since I am on the working group, but does the El Cerrito project require the entire amount? You only need part of that 600 and something thousand, right, to fully fund it?
Yes, it was, I can't remember the exact amount, it was 300 and something.
371.
371, thank you.
I looked it up.
Or thereabouts.
Yeah. And what's the pot have? What do we have left over? 6? Yeah. And I'll just add this. I feel like El Cerrito played really fair at the WCTAC level, in that they asked all the jurisdictions that got funding to reduce their initial request so that other projects could get funded. And now all the other projects, all these other ones are funded, and they did the right thing, and they're not fully funded, and they scored really well. So that's my completely biased pitch for
only one concern, the concern that staff has is that the guidelines were that the maximum request was 4.5 million, and this would be 4.8 plus for El Cerrito, and the same for San Ramon. It would be 4.7 something, 4.8 as well. That's the only concern.
But we have the working group to make those adjustments too, right?
Eric? Brad, do we have the ability to go back and instead of just looking at one cycle, looking at numerous cycles to make sure that the same jurisdiction isn't getting screwed every single time? My question is that when you look at it under this microscope and you say this jurisdiction X got the shaft on this particular one, you know where I'm going with this? I mean, can we look at a 5-year cycle to make sure that the same people aren't always getting hit?
Well, okay, I'll be glib and say this is a 5-year cycle, but we could go back and look at what projects have been combining this with OBAG 1, the first cycle of Measure J, TLC, and PBTF, and go back further to the CMA block grant and look at how much was available and which projects were funding and how much different regions and jurisdictions and types of agencies got. We could do that. We haven't, but we could. I don't know that I would say that that there are any particular jurisdictions that have gotten the shaft as you characterize it.
He was being less diplomatic than Leah, actually.
Any other questions or comments?
Eric?
Jerry?
I just had a question on the, you mentioned a $5 million commitment from SWAT for the next 2 cycles for the TLC. Has that been done before?
No. This is the second cycle of the Measure J funding program, so no, it's sort of implied that that's okay in Measure J, not directly. Measure J says that jurisdictions could take their funding and set aside funding for a reserve. That's sort of the corollary, and that you're pre-reserving funding. It's not explicitly allowed, but Measure J does suggest that RTPCs have some flexibility in that.
I guess my only question, since one of our projects is on the swap list, I understand that Concord staff, or Ray is out on vacation, I believe. Obviously, for us, we're okay with the swap. Assuming continuing on Concord is okay with it. The only question for them is, by eliminating the TLC portion of the funding, are they okay from a local match perspective for the additional federal funds?
My understanding is they are. That's from what they've submitted earlier.
Okay.
Yes. They'll still have sufficient funding to have the 11.47% match.
Okay.
He's on vacation.
Okay, Jason?
I guess as a member of SWAT, I guess I'm open to and supports the working group's recommendation.
Is that a motion?
Sure.
Yes. Do I have a second?
Second.
Motion by Jason and second by Steve. All in favor?
Aye.
No? Nay? Okay.
Thank you. I will also, just to add on to, since we're talking about funding, there probably will be an ATP call for additional funding that is going to be available through SB1 in July. And there's still a lot of unknowns on the shape of the program and whether there'll be a new call or whether the CTC will just go down the list of the projects that applied earlier. So if you don't want to go through the process of putting together another application, and you're close to getting funding through the ATP programs, you might hope that they take that approach. Hisham was at the CTC meeting yesterday where they discussed it, and he might be able to fill in a little bit more on that.
As you know, there is about $100 million a year from SB1 for ATP to augment the ATP program. The CTC staff discussed yesterday just going down the list of projects that were submitted for the prior cycle and didn't get funded. So if you applied and you were not funded, there is a good chance you will, if they take that approach. Some MPOs, I'm not sure if MTC was of them, wanted the opportunity to apply for new projects, and a decision hasn't been made whether they're going to allow this or not. So I think the message, if you applied for the last ATP cycle and you didn't get funded, you were just below the list, I guess get ready, because most likely you will be with the infusion of this additional money.
I guess the main difference being that the original ATP program was funded with Fed dollars versus this one will not.
That's right. This is all state money, so they will have more flexibility to allocate state-only funds to these projects.
There is one other issue, though, with the SB1, and that is there's the threat of a statewide initiative. And if there is an initiative put on the ballot to revoke SB1, which would only take a 50+1 vote by the public, then as soon as it gets on the ballot or gets approved to be on the ballot, then all the fund are stopped. All the fund collection is stopped. So it may be that you get funded, but you don't actually get funded. Just to rain on the parade.
And just really quick, as soon as they could get it to the ballot, it's like 18, right? But if they get approved, it freezes the funding?
No, if it gets on the ballot, it freezes the funding.
Right, but if they can't get till there to 2018, when's the year for the funding? Is it still same with the current ATP?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question.
Well, the SB1 funds would start pouring in November or so.
Yeah.
Where would these funds, wouldn't we accrue some money until 2018 when they actually get it on the ballot?
I think that they don't accrue while there's the measures being challenged.
Oh, okay.
But
They don't impose the new fees, or they stop imposing the new fees as soon as it gets on the ballot. That's my understanding.
Meaning once they submit enough signatures to get it on the ballot, everything stops.
Yes.
Any other questions? All right, any other business? Long enough? Okay. With that, I adjourn the meeting till next month.
Well,
I think that's a good start. He's a new Ross.